floor, thank you. Wonderful job. You may now return to class. Second floor, please return to class. Thank you.
Hey everybody, welcome back to World History. Today we're covering ancient Egypt, so go ahead and get your notes out and let's get started. So we're going to start off with some geography. The Nile River Valley, the main river of Egypt, as you can see here, is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, mainly because in terms of Northern Africa, primarily there is very little in terms of rivers and fresh water. Now, the control of this river is very important. Yearly, from year to year, it floods. There's a lot of silt to take care of, the irrigation, the dikes, and the reservoirs. Without the Nile River, Egypt would not be on any scale that it is today. So some more fun facts. You don't need to write these. It's the longest river in the world. It flows about almost 7,000 kilometers, or roughly 4,132 miles. It flows directly into the Mediterranean, and it usually discharges about 3.1 million liters or 680,000 gallons of water per second. It's a huge river basin that extends all the way down to countries like Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, the Congo, and Kenya. Now, the name origin of the Nile has been very debated because in Greek, Nilos, which means valley, and the Semitic Nahal, which means river. Well, that's where we kind of get the main idea of that's where the Nile came from in terms of its name. We don't know exactly which one is the correct one in terms of its historical origin. All right, here's some more maps of the Nile River. As you can see, it goes all the way up from the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to down here to Kenya and spills into Lake Victoria. So some more geography. When we talk about Egypt, we divide it into Upper and Lower Egypt, with Upper being in the southern part of what we assume is Egypt, and the lower part being more towards the Mediterranean Sea. Now, in the south, or Upper Egypt, they had something known as a cataract or a waterfall. That was the name that they used. And in the lower part of Egypt, in the north, they had what was known as the Nile River Delta. This is a triangle-shaped area of marshland formed by silt deposits. It's this triangle right here up in this map. Now, again, Mediterranean Sea also provided for a lot of sea trade, and the capital of ancient Egypt was the city of Memphis, which I surprisingly do not see marked on this map. Primarily, the Nile was used a lot for trade between Upper and Lower Egypt, mainly because they could just trade the goods right up the river. Okay, the Old Kingdom. So we're talking roughly 2575 BC to about 2130 BC. So we're covering about 400 years with this. It's where we get a lot of things like dynasties or the ruling families, the pharaohs or the title of the rulers and kings. They had absolute control over ancient Egypt, and they were basically viewed as a god on earth. When it comes to government, they established the bureaucracy, or a system of government that includes different job functions and levels of authority, and they had something known as a vizier, or the chief minister. Think very similar to what we have in the United Kingdom in terms of a prime minister. They were also in charge of irrigation, taxes, and farming, and making sure everything was functioning properly. Also during the Old Kingdom, we see the construction of the pyramids and something known as necropolises, or as we would know them, cemeteries. Now, during the Old Kingdom, they very much believed strongly in the afterlife, and we see that carried over into the New Kingdom as well. They preserved their bodies through the process of mummification and provided needs for the dead when they were buried in their tombs, whether that be things like chariots or chairs or clothing or food items. A lot of ancient tombs, when they've been found, have been found with many baskets of old food that dates all the way back to when the body was first interred, because they believed that if you buried those items with the dead, those items were then available for that dead person to use in the afterlife. So the decline of the Old Kingdom, eventually most things fade, that's normal, due to power struggles, crop failures, and the overall cost of the pyramids. They were quite expensive to construct, and they were primarily built with slave labor in terms of the construction. And the pyramids were quite a feat of engineering and construction at the time, especially when you consider they had to pull each one of those giant blocks up of a ramp just to get it to where it went. So before we get to the New Kingdom, we have the Middle Kingdom. We don't talk about it much, mainly because it didn't last very long. It was very turbulent, a lot of conflict, a lot of confusion. Some believe that it was a direct relation of what the gods believed, because the Nile River decided to be all irregular and act up. There was a lot of corruption in the government and rebellion on behalf of the populace. Another big thing to talk about is the Hyksos invasion, which was right around 100 years, roughly. Foreign invaders, they occupied the Nile Delta, which again, remember, was in Lower Egypt. And they were the first in the area to use horse-drawn war chariots, something that we see a lot of ancient civilizations pick up going forward. So, shortly after they get rid of the Hyksos, the New Kingdom arose and became very strong. A lot of strong pharaohs come from this time period, and it was an age of conquest for Egypt. They also made a lot of contact with civilizations in Southwest Asia and in other parts of Africa. They also gained a lot of territory. This is the Egyptian Empire at the height of ancient Egypt's power during the New Kingdom. As you can see, it's a lot bigger than what we associate with regular Egypt today. So, I might have briefly mentioned her previously, but we have the wonderful Queen Hatshepsut to speak about today. She was the first woman ruler known to history. She encouraged trade, and she ruled for over 20 years. That being said, she rose to the throne because her husband died, and her stepson, was too young to take the throne. He was only like 3 or 4 at the time of his father's passing. So instead, Hatshepsut stepped in and took over the country and became one of the first female rulers in the ancient world. It's also during this time Dahir el-Bahri was constructed, or the Valley of the Kings. It is said these statues here are meant to represent Queen Hatshepsut, who actually, during a lot of her reign, would wear traditional garments that were associated with male pharaohs. That includes this wonderful thing right here that we associate with the Egyptian chin. She would wear those along with the traditional male hat. Here's another view of Dahir el-Bahri, one of the largest ancient complexes to ever be discovered when we were really into our phase of exploring ancient Egypt. Okay, so let's talk about Hatshepsut's stepson, Tutmos III. He was a brilliant military leader, and he very much led the Egyptian army to a lot of success prior to taking over the throne. However, what wasn't very well known at the time, but we know now as historians, is that Tutmos III hated his stepmother and resented her for taking the throne and being on the throne for so long. So once he came to power, he basically said, we're going to erase Hatshepsut from the history books, and made sure that a lot of the things that she had done, her symbol, because each pharaoh had their own symbol, think of it like a signature, that sort of thing, was erased from a lot of the things that she did. And some things where they couldn't erase it, it was simply destroyed. He did expand Egypt the farthest and did very much increase the wealth, but I figured it was important to note what he did to his own stepmother. It's during this time also the Temple of Karnak was constructed, mainly for Amun-Re, his wife Mut, and their son Khonshu. This is the largest religious building ever in ancient Egypt, and one of the most expansive archaeological sites in ancient Egypt currently. The seventh pylon actually shows Tutmos III wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt and smiting his enemies with a club. I believe that is this image over here. These are various hieroglyphics and sculptures that you can find in ancient Egypt. Now, after Tutmos III, we had Ramses II. He ruled for 66 years. He had one of the longest reigning periods of any Egyptian pharaoh. He primarily was there to fight the Hittites and established the first international peace treaty when the Hittites finally said, we're done. So Nubia, again, was one of the other places that Egypt tried to conquer. It was directly to the south. They conquered it pretty easily and gained things like ivory, cattle, slaves, and a lot of art, soldiers, musicians, and prisoners. Remember, in this point in history, and for a decent bit further in history, when you conquered somebody, you took people prisoner, and typically they were either made into slaves, or if they were somewhat useful, whether that being an artist or a musician, they were put to work for the ruling and upper classes of the conquering society. So here's another hieroglyph example of the Nubians being subjugated by the Egyptians. Okay, so some religion, and it played a major role in ancient Egypt. Each one of the gods and goddesses in the Egyptian pantheon represented part of nature. So we had Amun-Re, the sun god, and the right to rule. I believe that is his image right there. Osiris, who was the goddess of the Nile and the underworld. Or god, I believe. Please do excuse me. That is a god, not a goddess. Osiris's wife, Isis, who was the goddess of corn, flax, weave cloth, and childcare, as pictured there. And then Set, the god of chaos. Every ancient religion seems to have one, whether it be Set in the Egyptians. You have your prankster gods in the Greek pantheon. You have Loki in Norse mythology. They all play a major role in that sort of thing. Amenhotep IV, he basically said, we're going to worship Aton only. He essentially wanted to change ancient Egypt from a polytheistic religion to monotheistic. Remember, we've talked about that previously. Polytheistic means that there's a belief in more than one god. Monotheistic, just one. He also changed his name to Akhenaten once he took the throne, and a lot of his ideas were actually rejected by the people. That also plays a lot into the views of the Egyptians in their afterlife. A lot was proving themselves. They were judged by Osiris, and they went through the process of mummification, or the preservation of dead bodies by embalming and then wrapping in cloth. The Egyptian mummification process actually took a number of months. The biggest portion of this was they took your body out into the desert, wrapped it, and put it in the sand, and let it basically embalm and dehydrate on its own in the elements. It's also important to note that mummification was primarily reserved for the rich. It was a very expensive process. You needed somebody willing to care for your dead corpse for months. They gave the sole use of the body was a lot of their beliefs. So when the soul left, the body was just meant to be preserved in case the soul ever wished to come back. It was very expensive, like I mentioned. And then here's an image example of mummification. During the process, most of your major organs would be removed and placed in canopic jars that would then be buried with your mummified body. The brain, which they viewed as just a pile of mush, nothing too important. In order to get it out of your skull, they would heat a iron poker of sorts with like a hook on the end, stick it up your nasal cavity, up your nose and into your brain, swirl it into a big mush, and then pull it out on the hook in chunks out your nose. And then they would proceed to anoint your body in certain oils and essential scents, and then wrap you in multiple layers of cloth prior to being placed in your sarcophagus. I believe these are some more images of various tombs that have been discovered over the years. The Valley of the Dead, I believe that is an image of, where they have found various tombs. There's another image in here, El Bari. And the Valley of the Kings, that is where a lot of famous pharaohs were buried. That includes people like King Tut, whose tomb was not discovered till the 1920s. So the Egyptians and their society was very much hierarchical in terms of social classes. You had the pharaoh and the royal family at the top. Underneath them was the government officials and the high priests. Below them was your merchants, your scribes, and artisans who viewed trade and war as a lot of opportunities to succeed. And then at your bottom layer, you had your peasants, mostly farmers and slaves. Here's a couple other image examples of that. Now, the role of women in ancient Egypt. Women actually had a very high status in terms of Egyptian society compared to other ancient cultures we'll talk about. They were able to inherit property, participate in business, buy and sell goods, go to court, obtain divorces, and become priestesses if they so choose. So it provided a lot of access for women. A lot of the ancient civilizations we'll talk about, primarily the woman's role was to be at home taking care of the children. But in ancient Egypt, if women didn't want to do that, they didn't have to. They had the option to go out and be directly involved in society. All right, so of course, we're talking ancient Egypt, we have to talk about hieroglyphics. This is the system of writing developed by Egyptian priests. Again, for the most part at this point in history, most writing was done by priests and scribes. Now, they created a system in which pictures represented words and sounds, and this was the highest form of writing in ancient Egypt and quite sacred. They started to do this writing on papyrus. Think of it as very early paper. This was a plant that grows along the Nile, and it was a paper-like writing material. We have a couple image examples of papyrus right here that have survived the ages. Now, for the longest time, we had no idea what most of these symbols meant, and that was until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by Jean Champollion, a French scholar. He deciphered and figured out the meaning of basically every single hieroglyphic because of this Rosetta Stone pictured here. It's a flat black stone monument, and the same passage is actually included on it in Egyptian, in hieroglyphics, and Demotic. I don't remember exactly where that language is native to, and then Greek. So this made it so you could easily translate one language from another. Because with the example of the ancient Greek language, we actually do have examples of that. Since we still have the knowledge of the ancient Greek alphabet, we were able to translate this and by extension, figure out, okay, what do these individual symbols up here mean? So another big thing that they did was furthering of science and math in ancient Egypt. Medicine massively grew in terms of moving away from the use of magic, a greater understanding of anatomy through mummification, understanding of symptoms, illness, cures, and even early surgeries were began in ancient Egypt. In the process of astronomy, they discovered the 12-month, 30-day calendar and then added 5 days to it. And then in terms of math, we can thank them for things like geometry, the understanding of flooding and redrawing the boundaries, the pyramids and those blocks they used to build them, and the overall designs of the temples. Those provided a lot of inspiration to future civilizations and to the basics of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics going forward. Now, in terms of Egyptian art, they used a lot of statues, wall paintings, and carvings, which was traditional for ancient Egypt. Here are a couple photo examples for you in terms of some of the hieroglyphic displays and carvings, as well as some of the statues as well. Now, when it comes to literature, they used a lot of things, such as hymns, prayers, proverbs, or short sayings with wise thoughts, one of which being, "A beautiful thing is never perfect," which I think is actually a pretty good proverb to know. They also did a lot of love poems. I do have one down below, circa 1300 BC. "The sound of your voice is sweet, full like the taste of date wine, and I, drunken girl in a tangle of flowers, live only a captive to hear it." Now, another big piece of literature to come out of ancient Egypt is the tale of Sinuhe, which very much talks about love and war and those sorts of things in ancient Egypt. And it's contained in a collection of other ancient Egyptian poems. There's a picture of the cover of the book that it is available in currently. All right, that is it for notes. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.